안녕하십니까. 정말 무더운 여름이 이제 지나간 것 같습니다. 여러분들 그럼에도 불구하고 건강한 모습으로 이렇게 많이 나와주셔서 대단히 반갑습니다. 그럼 오늘 회의를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What a long and hot summer we had this year, but the autumn is here, fortunately. Well, this morning we have a very, very special guest speaker who will tell us all about the future of global economy. Dr. Simon Baptist is global chief economist and managing director of Economist Intelligence Union, the unit in Asia. As you know very well, the EIU is very prestigious research and analysis organization which provides analysis and consultancy to government, industry, and corporations. Simon has been with the EIU for almost 5 years, you said? Yes, yes. He used to be a lecturer at Oxford University, and he is currently responsible for providing intellectual leadership for EIU's coverage, for ensuring that economic and political analysis and forecast are the best available for international decision makers, and for managing a global team of economists, consultants, and editors. As managing director for the EIU's Asia consultancy arm, Simon works with the government to design and assess the impact of public policy, and with companies to drive successful strategy and operational performance in Asia. Well, he, as I said, he is a very experienced economist, and he lectured at Oxford University and as an economic consultant, advising many governments and multilateral corporations, international organizations around the world. He got a doctorate degree in economics from Oxford University. His research was mostly concentrated on productivity and technology, particularly for emerging market corporations. I'm sure he will enlighten us this morning about the current global economic situation and the future of global economy. With no further ado, I would like to invite Simon Baptist to the podium. Please stand.
Thanks for coming along this morning, everybody. It's great to have the opportunity to discuss the future of economic growth with such an experienced audience in South Korea. It's why is South Korea such an interesting place to have this discussion? South Korea is one of those countries that is held up in the academic literature of being one of the big growth success stories. It's one of the very few countries that has made that transition from lower income to middle income to high income status over quite a short period of time. And many other countries around Asia and then also globally certainly do look to the South Korean example, and it certainly has informed A lot of what we now know is the story for how to help countries to move along that path. Now, South Korea now at a big transition point as well, trying to move on to the future stage of growth, looking beyond exports and looking beyond manufacturing more to the services sector and more to the domestic economy. And I just start by mentioning Korea because it's an example of some of the paths that we can see towards growth around, say, infrastructure, improvements in governance, improvements in education, and then also some of the challenges that the world has from this point forward, such as low productivity and needing to move into more creative and more innovative kind of economic activities. What I'm going to do today is I'll start off by giving you a bit of an overview of what we at the Economist Intelligence Unit see coming for the global economy over the next 2 to 5 years, the sort of trends that we can expect. Then I'll take a bit of a longer view and ask, well, what about moving out to 2030, 2040, 2050? What other kind of issues around growth can we expect at the global level, economic growth to continue at the same level it has? What might the impact of technology be? And which economies are going to be the biggest ones by the time we get to 2050, and how will the world's economic landscape look different by then? So just to start off with the current situation, these are three things that I'm thinking about when I think about the global economy in 2018, three kind of themes. Now, 2018, we're expecting to be a little bit of a slower year for the global economy than 2017. This year is actually quite a strong year for economic growth. Growth this year is looking like it's going to be about 2.8% at the global level. Last year was only 2.3%, so this year things have really picked up. Particularly in Asia, it's very noticeable the improvement in many of the export-led economies, where maybe if we went back six months or so, 6 months, 12 months in the past, export situation quite difficult. Things have improved quite a lot over the last 6 months. So right now, a bit of a sweet spot. However, the first point that I think about with this is that not all countries are in the same position. It's always true that countries are different, but right now they are more different than usual. Perhaps sometimes in the past, there's been a global economic cycle where countries have moved up or down together. But right now we see countries at very different stage of the economic cycle. Some countries are at the very end of the economic cycle, are probably facing a period of slowdown or perhaps recession. And China is probably the country that is furthest along its economic cycle, where we are expecting a bit of a slowdown. Other countries at the very beginning of the economic cycle, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, Nigeria, all coming out of recession and starting a period of growth, and then other economies like Japan or Europe more in the middle of the economic cycle. So some big differences when we look around different countries. The second key factor, and this is very much related to long-term growth, as we'll come back to later, is the low interest rate environment is set to continue. It's been with us for the last, almost decade now. We don't see the low interest rate environment going away. I don't think interest rates in Japan or in Europe or in the UK are likely to be raised before the end of the decade. So no interest rate changes between now and the end of 2020 in those central banks. The US Fed is increasing rates, but quite slow compared to historic perspective, and also even at their peak, which we think will come in 2020, US interest rates will still be less than 2%, as compared to maybe 4% before the financial crisis in 2008. So cheap credit and lots of money availability is going to remain a factor for the economy, and this dynamic of lots of savings and not much investment causing very low interest rates is one big factor that's causing growth to be a bit low in historical perspective at the moment. And the third thing I'm thinking about are some of the downside risks that could come for the global economy. The biggest one probably is China. We are quite worried about the level of debt in China, and I think it's now at the point where there does need to be a bit of a reckoning. I don't think China's going to have a financial crisis, but I do think it's going to have a period where banks certainly reduce their lending quite substantially, and there's a policy-driven slowdown to try and deal with some of the non-performing loans and shadow banking issues that are around in the Chinese economy. That's one sort of risk. A second big risk is in the US, where it's time to start thinking about the next US recession and when that is going to come. US has now had very long period of growth. The labour market is getting towards full employment. So I think it's time to start wondering about when the US business cycle is going to come to an end. And finally, on the downside risks, political risk and geopolitics are especially important right now. You probably won't be surprised to hear me say that political risk in the US is very high. I don't know if anybody can guess why that is. But certainly US politics a lot less certain than it has been. And that's having a lot of impact globally. It's causing other crises. And I would actually probably include North Korea in that, as well as, say, the Qatar crisis in the Gulf and things like the South China Sea. The lack of US kind of reliability in international relations is causing a lot of other conflicts to become more intense because the US is now no longer playing that role of being a sort of reliable enforcer of international rules. And so when there's less rules, countries tend to make decisions based upon short-term interest, and that means international relations are a lot less predictable than they were. So that's been an impact of the new US administration. Here's just a chart showing our ERU forecast for the different regions around the world. So this year, 2017 is in red, next year is blue, and 2019 is in grey. So two things to think about in this chart. First is just to notice the order in which countries are listed. So the fastest growing places are on the left, the slowest growing places are on the right. And the other thing to think about is the trend. So are the bars going up or are the bars going down for each of those regions? If you have a look at this chart, if you see on the far left-hand side is India. So India is now the world's fastest growing region. It's actually one of the world's fastest growing economies, and it's already a top 10 economy in terms of GDP. So it's quite a significant shift for the global economy. And it is, while there are some reasons to be pessimistic, say, about China or about the US, India is one place where there is a reason to be optimistic. This could be a little bit like the 1990s, where China, big economy at the top of the growth table. So now we have India, big economy at the top of the growth table. India, through the 2020s, could potentially transform the global economy in the same way that China did through the 1990s. There'll be some differences in the way that India grows, which we'll come back to, but certainly a very big trend and something that will be impacting the world a lot more in the next decade than it has been in the last decade. China is still in second place. It's still growing very fast, particularly when we consider that it's now a middle-income economy. So China's GDP per capita now similar to Malaysia, which upper middle-income country would expect it only to grow by kind of 4 to 5% would be a good year for Malaysia. So it's a bit strange to talk about 6% in China as being a bad year, but in historic perspective, it is a reduction. But by the way, I will be happier the lower the Chinese growth numbers go next year. China's growth has been pumped up over the last few years by a lot of excess credit through the banking sector, a lot of probably questionable activity being financed by the state-owned banks that's probably not doing a lot to increase China's productivity. So I think the more that China pushes growth artificially, the bigger the risk of a financial crisis. So I would prefer to see China slow down, and for a middle-income economy, a growth rate of something like 5% is a lot more sustainable than something like 7%. In third place is Southeast Asia. So, this continues this trend that's been going on for the last few decades of Asia really being the global growth hotspot. The focus is shifting within Asia. So, previous decades, Northeast Asia and East Asia were the key areas. Now, Southeast Asia and South Asia are taking over, but it's still this Asia-Pacific region is the global hotspot. Further down, you can see growth in the developed world, about 2% over the next couple of years, a little bit higher in Australia, a little bit higher in the US, and a little bit lower in the EU, and even lower in Japan. But those economies running at sort of between 1.5% and 2% growth typically. On the far right, a bit of improvement in some of the key emerging markets. Latin America and Africa really disappointed over the last couple of years. All the big economies, Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa, all have been in recession. A lot of it self-imposed through bad policy making in those countries. But we are seeing a recovery in each of those over the next couple of years. Brazil just come out of recession in the last quarter, and so growth in those regions should start to pick up as a result. So they're the regions at the beginning of the economic cycle. Just for interest, this is what our analysts at the EIU are forecasting as the fastest and slowest growing economies for 2018, so for next year. So there's India at the top of the growth table in the green, and it's sort of quite astounding to have an economy, as I mentioned, that's already a top 10 economy as one of the ones that is growing the fastest. The other hotspots up there's quite a lot in Southeast Asia. So you can see Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, all sitting there in the top 10. Other countries in South Asia doing well, so Bangladesh is there, but also Sri Lanka and Pakistan have decent amounts of growth as well. The South Asian story is not just about India, it's also about some of the surrounding economies. There's also a few African countries, is the other region that's represented in the growth table. Africa, very diverse, and some of the big economies have been growing very slowly. So it's Nigeria and South Africa, which between them are about 2/3 of Africa's GDP. But the other third, there's not much GDP there, but there are certain hotspots of exciting countries that are worth watching. There's one kind of grouping in East Africa, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Kenya, that are doing quite well, and then another little grouping in West Africa around Ghana, Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire that are also growing fast. And down the bottom, just sneaking in to the top list, is Iran, which is interesting and another trend worth watching long term. I think that Iran's move out of sanctions is going to be permanent. So there was an agreement made a couple of years ago to bring Iran back into the international scene. Donald Trump has made a few comments that he would like to perhaps put Iran back in the freezer and start the sanctions regime again. He's not going to have any support for doing that from the other important countries in Asia or in Europe, and mainly that's to do with business. Companies from France, Germany, Korea, China and Japan are already investing in Iran and don't want to stop that, essentially. And if Donald Trump takes the US out of Iran, I think the other countries will just say, thank you very much for getting rid of some competition. We're going to keep Iran open. So big population, quite well educated, used to have very good infrastructure. Of course, through the sanctions period, it's become a lot worse, but that now means there's big investment needs for upgrading the capital stock, and that kind of investment in capital goods is a big story. You might have heard about all the competition between Boeing and Airbus to get the airplane orders for Iranian airlines. That same thing is happening in other sectors, for example in healthcare, where there's also a big need for investment in new equipment. On the right-hand side are our predictions for the slowest growing economies. And so you'll see next year we are forecasting recession for North Korea. So maybe not a great place to invest. Economic growth next year will probably be negative. But more interestingly, up on the top, there's a few economies where larger economies where we think there will be slow growth in 2018. Japan is there. Perhaps it's a little bit unfair, because for Japan, to grow at 1% is a pretty good outcome. So Japan's population is shrinking. When you have fewer workers, well, if you want to keep GDP the same, you have to have each worker producing more. So you need productivity growth just to avoid recession. So a 1% performance by Japan, given its population dynamics, is quite a positive outcome. Other big economies growing slowly, Italy, and then the UK. The UK has entered that list really as a result of Brexit. So there's a 2-year period for the rules around how the UK will leave the EU to be negotiated. We are now 6 months through that 2-year period, and there's been very little progress so far. So businesses are starting to worry about what that transition will look like, and so business investment is starting to fall off. I know many companies in Asia who have used the UK as their European headquarters are kind of pausing on investments until they see what the trade regime will look like. On the consumer side, a big driver of UK growth after the Brexit referendum has been that consumers have stopped saving. So the UK savings rate has fallen quite substantially from about 6% down to about 2%. That extra consumption has been a boost to growth, but of course you can't save less than zero in the long run, so that savings decrease in the UK is coming to a natural end. That's going to cause growth to come down as well. Geopolitics also visible in this chart. So Qatar, a couple of years ago, one of the world's fastest growing economies. Now it's the largest exporter of LNG. Korea, a big customer. Due to the Saudi Arabia-Iran conflict, and I think the fact that the US is now less active in keeping the peace in the Gulf, that kind of simmering tension there has come to the fore. Qatar is really just a pawn between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but now Qatar is under something of a blockade or some sort of sanctions from 4 or 5 neighbouring economies. That there is going to drag on growth. We don't, by the way, see that crisis finishing anytime soon, expecting a couple more years of that to go. For the US, the new normal of growth for the US is about 2%. That's what growth has been like for the last couple of years. It now looks like the long-term potential of the US economy has gone from about 4% growth that we were seeing before the crisis down to about 2% growth. The chart on the bottom left is probably the important one to look at. This is the US unemployment rate. Light blue is the unemployment rate. Before the crisis, it was about 4%, a little bit above, then went up to nearly 10%. Since then, has come down quite consistently. Now unemployment back to the pre-crisis levels. So labour market looking like it's getting close to full employment. In fact, there's probably more unemployment than it appears in these figures. A lot of people in the US have left the labour market, so are not actively looking for work, or they don't have the type of job they want, or they have part-time work when they would prefer full-time work. So there is still more slack in the US labour market. So I think the US business cycle has got another maybe 2-3 years to go. But the next recession certainly closer than the last one for the US. I already mentioned China. Here's our forecast for China. GDP growth is in red, and if you have a look at 2018, you can see that slowdown that we are forecasting. Growth to come down from about 6.8% down to 5.8% next year, so a 1 percentage point slowdown. The different coloured lines show the different parts of GDP. So light blue is investment, dark blue is private consumption, and grey is the government. And you'll see that we are forecasting this slowdown to be very much focused on the investment sector. So companies that have got exposure to heavy industry or to construction or to property in China likely to be the companies or the economies that are most heavily affected by that. On the other hand, exposure to China's consumer sector or areas of government spending such as healthcare are likely to weather this turn down a lot more. The real trade-off in China is short-term versus long-term. So my belief is that I think President Xi and the Communist Party in China are well aware of these dynamics. The longer they keep propping up growth through the credit market, the higher the risk of a crisis in the future. But of course, dealing with the bad debts in the banking system will bring growth down in the short term. So it's a trade-off between short-term pain versus the risk of a financial crisis in the future. The longer that goes on, the higher the risks of the financial crisis. Why do we think next year is the year the government will do something about it in China? It's because of politics. So in China, the economy is led by politics rather than by economics. And we have the big party congress coming up in October when President Xi is hoping to get his new leadership team in place for the next 5 years. And also we think setting the scene for him staying on for a third term as Chinese president, which would be the first time since Chairman Mao that we'd had somebody stay in that leadership position for that long. He wants no bad news between now and October, so certainly the debt issue not dealt with until after the party congress. But once his political team is in place, and I think he probably will get what he wants, as much as we can tell what goes on in the China Communist Party, but assuming he gets what he wants for next year, then I think he'll be strong enough to be able to cope with the political fallout from a slowdown in growth. So that's why we think that growth is happening next year. I don't think it's going to lead to any social unrest in China. Social unrest in China is not so much about employment or jobs. It's much more, in fact, about the environment is probably the issue that is the likeliest cause of any social unrest in China. But the government still has a very tight grip on society. So I think any social unrest is a very low probability outcome in China. Just moving on to one of the other major economies, which is India. So it's now ranked about 7th in the list of global economies, but it's one that is growing very fast, and so I think it's really worth keeping top of mind and keeping on the agenda. India's had potential for a long time. When I talk to people about how we think India is going to do well over the next decade, a lot of people don't really believe it. They are a bit skeptical because they say, well, India's had potential for a long time. It's always disappointed and never managed to actually to deliver me any profit or deliver me any kind of good investment opportunities. So why should this time be any different? The reason to think it's different now, or the reason why we think it's different now, is about politics. All the fundamentals are the same. India's growth basically comes from urbanization. They've got hundreds of millions of people that can move from low productivity rural jobs into into middle productivity factory or service sector jobs in cities. Just that basic shift. It's what China did in the 90s. That shift from rural to urban can drive a decade of 6 to 10% growth. I don't think India will get to 10%. More likely it will be 6 or 7. So that's one difference to China. But that's the fundamental reason for India to grow. Why can it happen now? Because the political stability is enabling improvements in the business environment and it's enabling investment. The President of India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has a majority in Parliament. He's had that for a couple of years, but it's the first time in 40 years that one party has had control of India's Parliament in their own right. He is also getting control of more and more states. This map shows which states are controlled by his party as well, and you can see there's every year more and more of those get coloured in. So there's now more policy coordination between the national and the state governments, and this is driving some real change in India. So, for example, the introduction of the National Goods and Services Tax was a milestone. There are still some inefficiencies. And there are still some things that we could improve with that tax, for example. However, the fact that it's been introduced and it has reduced regulation somewhat is an example of the kind of reform that is going on in India. India's growth, though, is going to look different to China's growth, so it will have a different impact on the global economy. One thing is it's not going to be as fast, which I already mentioned. Some other ways that it's going to differ. India's transition will be more about services and less about manufacturing. I don't think India is going to become a big manufacturing powerhouse in the same way that China did. It's going to be much more about the services sector. Another big difference is it will be less about exports. So China's growth really came from exporting. I think India's growth is going to come more from domestic consumption at an earlier stage. When you see this chart here, red is the growth of India's economy. The thin green line is what happens if you take out trade. And the thing to note, green and the red are very close together. So trade not having a big impact on India's economic growth, imports and exports are roughly balancing out, but the big consistent driver is the dark blue line, which is that private consumption. Key things for India are skills, urbanisation and infrastructure. And India is doing well on 2 out of 3 of those. It's doing well on urbanisation, that's driving lots of growth. Infrastructure has improved in India quite a lot over the last 5 years. Of course, more to do, but if the business environment can remain solid, that investment will come. Skills is where India is doing less well. At the top level, India's best universities are globally competitive and very, very high quality. However, mass education is very poor. Primary and secondary school in particular are quite poor. And education takes a long time to feed through the economy. Even if you made the education system perfect today, it takes 16 years for somebody to move through it, and then once you have your skills, you have them for the rest of your working life. So skills is an area where India does need to prioritise quick improvements if it's going to be able to capitalise on its growth potential. These are the countries that we think are going to see the biggest investment growth over the next 5 years. So this is now looking out to 2021, so taking a bit more of a longer term view. And there are 4 kind of trends that differ country by country as to where the business investment opportunities are likely to be highest over the next 5 years. The 4 kind of factors that separate these countries out, some of them have growing workforces. The Philippines and India are 2 big examples there. Some of these countries are recovering from crisis, so Egypt is one example, or Ireland, are places where investment is kind of recovering from a period of crisis, or Iran. I've already mentioned the sanctions period. Some countries are reforming, so undergoing economic and policy reforms that I think are going to lead to more investment. Argentina and Vietnam are 2 examples of countries that are reforming, leading to more investment. And finally, there's a set of countries that have really high infrastructure needs. India is one of those, so is Indonesia, and so is Turkey. However, these numbers are all still relatively low. I mean, if you think these are the countries with the fastest level of investment growth over average growth over the next 5 years. I mean, making the top kind of 15 countries, you'll see, is New Zealand with just 2.6% per year expected investment growth. That's quite a low number, really, and this is a reflection of the fact that global investment is really at very low levels. Corporate savings are at very high levels, and I know this has been an issue in South Korea. It's also an issue in Japan and in other economies as well. US firms also high levels of corporate savings. Why is it that firms are not wanting to invest at the moment? It's one of the biggest questions around economic policy, and it's one of the key reasons why growth is still only at around 2.5% globally, as opposed to the 4% that we saw before the financial crisis. Demographics is one reason why investment opportunities have been looking a bit weaker and why savings rates have been going up. More and more countries are hitting the transition point where their workforce starts shrinking. In this chart, workforce growth for the last decade is in red, for the next decade is in blue. And the pattern for almost every country is the blue line is below the red line. So this is a reduction in the growth rate of the workforce. At the far right-hand side, there's countries where the workforce is actually shrinking. So Japan, and interestingly China, already at the point where its workforce is shrinking. South Korea, almost there. So basically zero workforce growth expected in South Korea over the next decade. The big worry, I think, for some countries is those middle-income countries like China and perhaps Thailand might be a surprise to some people, to see how quickly these developing economies are aging. Thailand's age structure is not that different to South Korea's, but of course Thailand is much poorer than South Korea. It does not have the kind of healthcare systems to enable people to be productive into older life. The firms don't have the kind of technologies that enable workers to be productive for longer, and there are big issues around pensions and provision for the elderly. So a lot of countries, particularly in Asia, are facing this problem of getting old before they get rich. And China and Thailand stand out, but other countries aging fast as well. Vietnam also aging quite rapidly, as is Malaysia. The two big exceptions on the left are the Philippines and India. So they're countries where the workforce growth is actually accelerating. They are at the point in their demographic transition that South Korea had in the 60s and 70s, which is the time when the birth rate starts to fall. So you have fewer kind of young people to look after, but improvements in healthcare mean that your workforce is growing, people are living for longer through their working life, and they're able to be more productive. So India and the Philippines now in that spot. It's a real important decade for those two economies as a result. This opportunity comes once for each country. You get it once as your demographics change, and the action that you take to either use that or not use it have big consequences for the future. South Korea is a country that used it well. I mean, so did Japan. There's a few Asian examples. So did Taiwan, where that demographic transition was used well, where that period was used to upgrade skills and to build sort of the healthcare and pension systems to cope with an aging population. Other economies have not done so well through that transition. South Africa is one example. The result of South Africa's transition is poor skills, and as a result, 30% unemployment rate. So the situation the Philippines and India are going through is an opportunity, but it's not guaranteed that it's going to work. So policy making in those countries are very, very important. I mentioned before that the global economy has a problem of too much savings and not enough investment, and that this is holding down growth. I've just put up a map here showing for each country how much each country is saving as a share of its GDP. So the red countries are saving a lot, the blue countries are spending a lot. So this means that the countries in red are effectively paying for consumption in the countries that are in blue. So when we look at this map, we sort of want to ask, well, is that a sensible flow of savings? And in many cases, it's not. Now, Asia is the big, is the standout continent there, where you see many Asian economies are not just kind of orange, but they're actually quite, a dark orange or even a red color. So Asian economies as a whole, very, very high savings compared to GDP. And some of the economies that are in blue, I mean, US and Canada are some examples there. That's where Asian savings are going. So there's still this dynamic which has been true for many decades now, where Asian savings are funding consumption in North America. Now, given that Asian growth rates are much higher than those in the US, that's actually not a very sensible transfer of funds from a global perspective. Because Asia is growing faster, there should be more investment opportunities in this region and more opportunities for higher returns in the faster growing economies. But in fact, we have fast growing economies like China or like Vietnam or Indonesia actually sending their savings abroad rather than investing domestically. This tells us that one of the key policies that is important in order to get these savings to work and increase global growth for the future is to improve the investment climate in some of these countries that are in the orange or red colours, so that some of their savings can be put to work in higher in higher return locations. For countries like Germany and Japan, and I think Korea is getting to this point as well, where there are high savings rate, the question is more about preparing for the future. So I think for Japan and Germany, it makes sense to have high savings because they have aging populations and they're going to have smaller workforces in the future. So they do need to have savings in order to provide for future income in the country. But what's important is where that savings is invested and what that savings is achieving for the global economy. In the case of Korea and Japan, the big issue has been that corporations have been where the saving has been rather than households, and corporations have been building up cash reserves rather than investing them. I was talking to some colleagues earlier before because I know that South Korea has been trying different policies around tax to try and encourage corporates not to save so much cash. Actually, I have not seen any good evidence yet on the impact of that. So if anybody has seen a study or perhaps done one that discusses the impact of that tax, I'd be very interested to read it. So that's the current situation in the world. Moving on, I want to now talk about what might happen over the next few decades. This is a chart of productivity growth, and the message I want to give you here is that the last century was really remarkable for how fast growth was, and we shouldn't assume that the kind of economic growth that we saw on average through the 20th century is going to continue in the future. It's quite possible that could have been a one-off period. If we go sort of earlier in history before 1810, so on the left-hand side of this chart, productivity growth everywhere globally was essentially zero, and it had been zero for almost all of recorded history. So through the 1700s, productivity growth in the economies for which we have data was almost zero, so 0.2 or 0.1% per year, so very, very low. Then through the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, you can see there's that uptick in economic growth, and then in the 1900s, even faster economic growth. And Korea, of course, notably a part of that in the latter half of the century. So that period from 1810 to 2010, saw productivity growth of sort of 1.5 up to 2% on average every year through the 20th century, and that's what, alongside with investment and population growth, then led to economic growth of sort of the 4 or 5% that we saw through the last century. Since the financial crisis, that rate of productivity growth has come down quite substantially. So gone from sort of like 1.8% in the US, for example, down to about 1.3%, down from 2% in France, down to about 0.5%. And that picture is mirrored across almost every developed economy, including in South Korea. So the one big question policymakers are now asking is that slowdown temporary? Is it just an economic cycle, or is it permanent? And there are some reasons to worry that it might be permanent, and whether the new technologies that are coming in the digital space are going to have the same impact on the economy as those technologies such as electricity had through the 19th and 20th centuries. And many economists are skeptical, and they say, well, being able to like things on Facebook or write something in 140 characters is not going to have the same productivity impact as running water or electricity. So where can future economic growth come from? For those of you who can remember your first economics lessons, it can come from either workers, it can come from capital, or it can come from productivity. So they are the three kind of sources for economic growth. Developed countries are certainly worried about getting growth back up to the levels they've seen in the past. And for emerging markets, the question is a little bit different. It's still more about catch-up. How do we catch up to where the developed countries are at the moment and move from that middle income to high income status? So when we think about these sources of growth, you can either get more investment and have more technology and more capital stock, more infrastructure. You can have more workers, perhaps more in number or more in quality. You can have more productivity, so the way you combine workers and machines together to produce things can become more efficient. Finally, I might sort of add in there, a fourth factor could be the use of natural resources and the efficiency with which we use the goods that the environment provides us. Very hard to measure, and no country really measures that very effectively. So it's often left out of the discussion, and I'll be leaving it out of the rest of my discussion because of these kind of measurement issues. But I think it's important to kind of remember as a concept, because in the future I do think environmental constraints will be relevant for economic growth. Looking at what's happened in China in the past, here's how China's growth has split between those different factors. Yellow is China's growth due to investment, red is China's growth due to labour force, and blue is China's growth due to productivity. The thing to note from this chart is just how fast China's growth from productivity has been. In its faster decades in the early 2000s, 7% productivity growth per year, and even since the crisis that growth has been 4%. So very, very high in historical perspective, higher than what the US achieved through the 60s and 70s when the US had a big productivity boom. China could do this because it was catching up. So it didn't have to invent new technologies, it just had to copy those that were already used elsewhere. The same model, by the way, that Japan and South Korea use too. And in fact, when you're an emerging market, there's nothing wrong with copying the technologies and production processes of elsewhere. In fact, it's the most sensible thing to do. And there are many other emerging markets that have still got that potential. I talked about India, but of course there are many other countries, Vietnam, Nigeria, Colombia, that have got that same kind of potential. The strength of the Chinese economy, investment has stayed very high. So China has good infrastructure. That is a positive factor for long-term growth. It's had a lot of productivity gains from rural-urban migration. That's something I think India can copy. And the education system in China has been quite good as well. So Chinese workers are pretty well educated, and that good basic level education, primary level, high school level, that China had in the 1980s really set the scene for China's growth in the 90s and the 2000s. Some challenges: workforce now shrinking, so in the future that red part is going to be negative. So the workforce will be subtracting from economic growth. And I'm also a bit worried about the impact of debt in China. I think there's some risk if the government does not deal with debt in China that it has a decade-long slowdown like Japan had, a lost decade as banks really stopped lending and a lot of companies that are not productive or not profitable but are kept alive through funding from the banks and are a productivity drain on the economy. China's next productivity growth really would come from reform of state-owned enterprises. And President Xi is probably not likely to reform SOEs. In fact, he's increasing the role of state-owned enterprises in the Chinese economy. So this is a big negative factor for me for China's future growth, because when I ask where's the next productivity gain coming from, I think it's opening up protected sectors such as banking, such as energy, such as healthcare, but I think the government in China is unlikely to do that in the near future. So where could growth come from? So I mentioned the point about SOE reform. There is scope in China for more efficient use of natural resources. So its use of energy per unit of GDP is about 10 times higher than in Japan. So lots of investment in energy efficiency could have a productivity return in China. China now needs to start innovating itself rather than just copying from elsewhere. I think it's a big question of whether China can do that. We've never really seen a country combine political sort of control and lack of freedom of expression and freedom of thought and innovation. No country has combined those yet. China is trying to combine them. I don't think it's there. China has a lot of patents and spends a lot on R&D. You will see that in the statistics. But Chinese patents, there are a lot of them, but they're much lower quality than the kind of patents coming out of Japan, Korea, Europe, or the US. Immigration is one source of future growth. This is true across much of East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan as well. With shrinking workforces, that's going to be a negative for growth. Immigration could overcome that, but East Asia as a region tends to be a bit against immigration. Society is not that welcoming of immigrants, and government policies not supporting it. These are certainly choices that individual countries can make, but a consequence of not being open to immigration is that it will be lower growth for the future. Just comparing the United States, US growth, you can see, has looked quite different to that in China. Interestingly, the red part is much bigger for the US. If we look through previous decades, population growth has been a big driver of the US economy. And this is also true for some of the other developed countries that have typically grown faster. So like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and UK until just recently were all the countries amongst the OECD that had the highest levels of immigration. And so those countries saw growth in their populations and so then saw higher economic growth as a result. Productivity growth in the US much lower, around 1% per year, but that's the blue part, getting smaller over time, particularly in the recent period. When you're one of or maybe the most advanced economy, it's more difficult to get productivity gains because you've got to make up new ways of doing things. So these rates of 0.5% to 1%, much slower than China's kind of 5 to 7% rate of productivity growth. The US and the OECD have this long-term challenge about productivity growth. I'm just showing on the right a chart of productivity growth in different economies through the 90s and then in the period since. Dark blue is the more recent period. In all of those economies, the recent productivity growth has been much, much lower than in the past. So this slowdown is something that we see everywhere. Why is it happening? One reason is lower labour force growth. So in most of these economies, there was a big surge of women entering the workforce. So you had half the workforce that sort of prior to 1970 was essentially not working, and now they almost all are. So that's a big transition. That can only happen once. We don't have another 50% of people sitting around that we can bring into the labour market. So that's a one-off source of growth. Potentially for Korea, it's one area where there is still the potential for that to contribute a bit more in the future. The expansion of mass university education is another kind of one-off factor. So the OECD essentially went from university being for around 10% of the population to university being for almost everyone. So that's a big increase in the quality of the workforce. That transition has now happened in the OECD, so that growth driver has come to an end. And though those two factors mean that the workforce is unlikely to be a driver of growth in the future. So then we turn to investment and those issues I spoke to before about things that we can do to encourage more investment in different economies. What can be done to encourage the mobilisation of these savings that we see, particularly in Asia, so that we can get savings into productive activities, into investment that can then contribute towards keeping economic growth continuing? It's something that there are choices to be made around. Some people are optimistic about the future of growth. They think, well, technology has always come along. It's always created jobs, ultimately, in the past. We might be worried at the moment about things like robotics or artificial intelligence taking away jobs, but this is just the same as technologies back in the Industrial Revolution, where people who used to sew clothing together also lost their jobs, but then in the end they got higher productivity jobs doing something else. So there are some people who are confident about the ability of the economy to absorb these changes and optimistic that technology is going to lead to a lot of growth. On the other hand, there are those who are more pessimistic, who think that current technologies are much more about our leisure time rather than our working time. So many of the big, we look at the kind of companies today with the biggest kind of valuations in the US stock market, things like Facebook, Google or Amazon. A lot of their activities are around our leisure time, so it's around our social lives or around shopping or around media. Is where the big innovations have been. And these sectors are unlikely to contribute towards future productivity growth in the same way that the innovations of the previous 1 or 2 centuries did. For example, the impact of running water on urbanization or on sanitation, on reducing disease and increasing working lives, or on electricity in enabling the manufacturing boom and centralization of production and the economies of scale as a result of that. So they're the sort of technological pessimists who think that the kind of things that we're developing now are not going to result in future economic growth, and we have to get used to growth of 1 or 2% being normal for the world rather than 3 or 4%. I don't think either of those are necessarily going to happen. I actually think we have quite a bit of control over what goes on, which is maybe a reason to be optimistic if you think policymakers and governments and companies and the public can have effective debates around these issues and agree on good policies, or you can be pessimistic if you think that you don't trust governments and companies to come up with the right solutions. What are some things that could happen? Asia does need to reduce its level of savings. Asia needs to save less and spend more so that Asia's resources that it's created through its long period of fast economic growth are kind of put to work generating further growth in the future. I think one thing that many Asian countries do need to do is improve the quality of public health care and improve the quality of the pension system. That's one reason why households save a lot in certain countries like Vietnam or in China, because they know that when they get old or if they get sick, the government won't look after them, so they need to have the money themselves. So governments building better social protections is one way to liberalise some of those savings. Increasing labour force participation is another issue, and is increasing people's working lives. So for many OECD countries, this is about increasing the retirement age, which has gone up a lot slower than life expectancy. So my father, lucky him, he retired when he was 57. So all going well, he'll probably spend almost as long in retirement as he spent working. I'm kind of guessing by the time I get to that point, I'm not going to have the pension system around to enable me to retire for 30 years. And the earlier that transition happens, the better the impact on future economies. There's another area which is to improve the number of people that can enter the workforce from your existing population. I already mentioned improving the participation of women in the workforce. There's other groups as well where, depending on the country, there's the potential for you to get more out of the existing population. For example, LGBT people or disabled, people with disabilities, ethnic minorities, people, and the US is the big example here, who perhaps have had a criminal record, find it very hard to get back into the US labour market, and there's a lot of them because the US likes sending people to jail. So improving the participation of some other marginalised groups is probably a policy that could receive more attention. Another one is tax reform, and this is something that I know South Korea has been experimenting with. For example, taxing assets rather than taxing income to raise money for expansion. Big questions around the future of intellectual property, and I think in particular how we tax robots. And how the value in technologies like artificial intelligence are considered for the taxation system. Intellectual property as it exists today, already very complicated to tax. Those issues are going to get even more important with the development of machine learning, artificial intelligence and robotics, where even more economic value is going to be embodied in something that's not physical, like in a program that potentially could be located anywhere. Another one is environmental or green taxation, so removing taxation off income and off labour and onto things that we want to discourage, for example, maybe greenhouse gas emissions or other forms of pollution. So there's some thoughts about the future of growth and what we can do. I'm just going to finish by showing you some of our predictions for 2050. I suppose everything won't come true. There's a lot of uncertainty between now and then. But I wanted to show you what we at the EIU are thinking is the current long-term trajectory for the world's economies. So this is our prediction for the top 10 economies in 2050. The left is what we have today, and on the right is what we have in 2050. Actually, I've shown, I think, is it the top 12? Because I wanted to get South Korea in there for you. Yeah? So South Korea is there as number 12 at the moment. The situation in 2050 looks somewhat different. There are many economies that are still there, and the base and many of them are of the big economies today, big economies in the future. But there are three big changes between now and 2050 that we see coming. The most important one to note is India. So India has moved up from being kind of in the middle and much, much smaller than the two largest economies today. So India is very small compared to China and the US today. By 2050, the three of those economies are a similar kind of size. Up in fourth place, and in fact coming from not even being in the top 10 now, is Indonesia. It's one country we think short term, in the medium term, we're a little bit pessimistic over the next 5 years. But out to 2050, we have a much more optimistic view of Indonesia. Similarly for Mexico, moving up into the top 10 as well. Countries moving down, so Italy falls right out. So does Canada, and I'm sorry to say, so does South Korea. Falls out of the top 12 by 2050. Just some interesting dates on our current forecasts. We think China gets bigger than the US in 2032. We think India catches Japan in 2029. Indonesia catches Japan in 2044. And Mexico overtakes Canada in 2037. So some dates to put in your diary for the moment. Four kind of trends to 2050. The balance of power shifting, engines of growth changing, who's going to win, who's going to lose, and some countries will have a big GDP, but not a big GDP per capita. The rise of Asia continues out to 2050, as does the decline of Europe. Asia is here in dark blue. Its share of the global economy risen already, about 21% in 1980. It's now sitting at around 42%. We think that gets up over 50% by the time we get to 2050. That share of Europe in light blue at the top also shrinking quite a lot through that time. So that shift to Asia continuing. The top three economies also in 2050 really dominating the global landscape, being much, much bigger than everything else. So this is our 2050 prediction. China, US, India, all roughly the same size and a lot bigger than everything else. So they'll each be roughly the same size as the next 5 economies combined. So 2050, those 3 countries are really dominating economic power. And the big change from today, where the US and China are already the 2 economic powers, is the addition of India into that, but also the gap between the others increasing. The engines of growth are changing. Here's a chart of GDP growth from 1980 out to 2050. Obviously, some of it is actual and some of it is our prediction. And you can see at different times, different economies have been taking the running. For the US, is in black. Its growth was faster earlier in the period. The US's period of really fast growth was in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And that growth rate coming down, and I mentioned already, we see 2% as the new normal for the US. If it wasn't for immigration, it would be more like 0.5% or 1% for the US. Through the 1980s, South Korea in blue being one of the big contributors, and then growth rate sort of coming down quite rapidly now at sort of developed world levels and probably even falling below that of the US for the future, mostly because of the different rates of immigration, causing Korea's GDP not to grow so much. China then came along through the 80s and 90s, the red line being the fastest one. And then after China, there's the India, the orange line, coming up through the sort of 2010 out to about 2025. India then being the big driver of growth. After that, in green coming on are some of the African economies. I put Nigeria up there as an example. So there's the engines of growth kind of transitioning through out to 2050. Who are the winners? Who are the losers? I've mentioned population a few times. I think this is really, really important. These countries on the left are where we expect to see the biggest increase in the workforce. So that's people aged between 15 and 65 on the current definition. And red is the current workforce and blue is the workforce in 2050. So Nigeria, Pakistan, Philippines, Kenya are the 4 countries with the biggest increase in the workforce. That's going to mean a big increase in their economies as well. Not necessarily in living standards, but certainly in the size of the economy. On the right is those same countries, their total GDP growth out to 2050 in black, and the part of that which is due to population growth is in blue. So those countries on the left having the biggest impact from rising population: Angola, Kenya, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Philippines. Without that population growth, their forecast GDP growth would be a lot lower. On the other hand, on the left, these are the countries where there's the biggest decrease in the labour force. So red is now, blue is 2050. Biggest decreases in Japan, Russia, Germany, and Thailand. And yeah, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, South Korea is also there as one of the countries with the biggest decrease in the workforce. So on the right, when we look at how does population in blue contribute to growth, it's negative, so it's below the zero line. So black is GDP growth for those countries. Red is what they're getting from investment and productivity, but actual growth is lower than that because of the drag from reduction in the workforce. Most of these economies are in East Asia and in Europe, but I mentioned there are some places like Thailand and Vietnam's not in the chart, but its story is along those lines. It's not just going to be rich countries that are going to see this dynamic. The BRICS has always been more about politics than economics. Certainly out to 2050 we see very different outcomes. Here's the forecast for the BRIC economies, and I've included Indonesia in that just because it's going to be so large by 2050. The Asian BRICS are doing a lot better than the others. India growing the fastest, then Indonesia, then China. Brazil and Russia really not growing that fast at all out to 2050. Here are our forecasts for South Korea. So there's the recent past on the left-hand side where GDP was growing by about 4% a year. Per person, it was growing by about 3.5%. In the middle, there's the next period, what we think is going to happen over the next 10 to 15 years. Both of those numbers come down. GDP growth about 2%, GDP per person growing by about 1.7%. Out to 2050, those numbers fall even further again. GDP growth averaging about 1%. But interestingly, the green now gets above the red as we get out to 2050. GDP per person growing faster than GDP because of that population decline. What are some negatives for GDP? One is slow population growth, but it is worth emphasising that GDP is not everything. There's a lot that matters apart from GDP. As an economist, I don't want to fall into the trap of always assuming that more GDP is good. Something that's certainly important is GDP per capita. Yeah? So Japan's had very slow growth for a long time, but its living standards have been rising because GDP per person has been growing roughly the same as the US. So if you're a Japanese person, in fact your living standard has been rising at the same rate as that of an American, even though your GDP rate of growth has been a lot lower. So population is important not just because it leads to lower GDP growth, but because we have to remember that really it's GDP per person that ultimately matters for the way in which people live. A big challenge for Korea going forward, another potential negative, is competition from other emerging markets in Asia. China is one where there's competition already, but of course in the future there'll be more from places like Vietnam or Indonesia, moving up the value chain and providing competition for the existing industries. South Korea's need to diversify exports, still a challenge, and also it could get some growth by opening up more to FDI. At the moment, relatively restrictive, and so that's a negative on the growth as well. Some of the positives: very strong research and development culture, quite a good track record, in fact an excellent track record in terms of innovation and technology, and a lot of potential in the services sector where there'll be more growth in the future than in manufacturing. What could be a positive or a negative? I thought there is, reunification, or whether it's reunification or North Korea kind of emerging out of its current situation. Unknown exactly how that will have an impact. My personal view probably is it will be a short-term negative and a long-term positive. Long-term, I think North Korea has massive growth potential, very inefficient economy, huge gains if the kind of technologies and production methods used in the South were used in the North. But getting to that point will probably be very costly and involve a period of very slow growth. These are the fastest and slowest growing economies out to 2050, according to our forecast. I'm getting very close to the end now, so please do think if you have any questions you'd like to ask. On the left are the fastest growing countries we think out to 2050. A lot of those in Africa, Kenya, Angola, again some of these South Asian economies, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam and Philippines doing well now, expecting that to continue out to 2050. On the right hand side are the economies where we see the slowest growth now out to 2050. Slowest growth in Italy and Japan, and then a smattering there of economies, mostly from Europe, but a couple from Asia, so Singapore and Taiwan in there as well as some of the slowest growing economies. Now going per person, because I'm trying to take my own advice and remember to think about per person as well as total GDP. Fastest growth in living standards. These are not the same economies. You'll see some of those that are growing fastest in total terms, like Kenya and Angola. Kenya is there, like Angola, and is not here in the fastest per capita. So it's got a big population growth, but not fast growth in living standards. Fastest living standards growth. So India, Kenya, and Vietnam are the three countries where we see the fastest living standard growth there. Some interesting ones: Cuba, perhaps an example of a country that's sort of coming out of isolation. Like I already mentioned, Iran, similar story in Cuba, expecting quite fast growth there. Libya, also a country where we have an optimistic long-term outlook from the current situation. On the right-hand side, those with the slowest GDP per capita growth. And what's kind of interesting is some countries entering this line that were not amongst the slowest growing, and Australia is one example there. It's not one of the slowest growing economies because we expect it to have quite fast population growth, but it is one of the slowest growing per person. So Australia's growth to be quite reliant on the fact that its population and workforce are going to be continuing. Other countries here, a lot of European ones, as you might expect, a few from East Asia, so there's Japan and Singapore in there, and also some of the Middle Eastern economies, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, where we think by 2050 the transition away from oil will mean that they'll be facing a period of slow per capita growth out there. Just comparing some of the numbers per person. This is GDP per capita for some selected economies. I've included South Korea there as the third one. There's 1990, so the past, so 2017 now, and then our prediction for 2050. While places like China, India, and Indonesia are going to have big GDPs in 2050, they won't necessarily have big GDP per capita, and they'll still be quite a long way behind the rich countries of today. These countries are ordered by their expected GDP per capita in 2050. So when you look, say, at today, the countries where the bars are kind of dented inwards, like India and like China, are those countries we're more optimistic about in the longer term in terms of per person growth. So I'll finish up there. So I hope I've sparked some ideas about what we see happening in the global economy now. The three big themes: growth differing a lot by country, the low interest rate environment and the lack of investment being a big factor, and a lot of geopolitical risks. Question marks over whether growth can continue, particularly linked to this issue about what does the world do with its savings, how do we put those into productive use. Some policies that I think could be effective in terms of getting more investment happening around the world, and then what we think happening after 2050, the world really dominated by China, the US and India, that far out into the future. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to having any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Baptist, for very, very comprehensive and illuminating and interesting coverage of global economic terrain, current and future. It was very, very comprehensive, very, very well done. Now, with this, we have only about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&As. Have any questions or comments? Maybe very brief. Yes, Dr. Kim, please.
Simon, thank you very much for your very comprehensive talk. Essentially, we are talking about the global issues, two issues, growth and also distribution, equity issue. But I'm not so sure how much of the issues will exactly the way we look at it now, if we change the metrics of analysis. You mentioned the really salient point of per capita analysis, like the growth in Japan, in terms of slowing down the population. But if you look at globally, if we could measure such a thing as purchasing power parity kind of income measurement, globally per capita, all those issues they're talking about, the slowing down the growth and the inequity of distribution are real. I believe in the global sense, income distribution has come down a heck of a lot closer if you look at the way I would look at it. Number two, we are naturally worried about particularly policy analysis kinds of people. By nation, there's growth, etc. But it is only natural the wealthy nations' distribution, income distribution, will only widen as the lower echelon is capable of being replaced by the low income resource countries. And it is not necessarily, I'm not just necessarily defending the globalization, but we believe globalization and its impact overall, I think it has been very, very positive in total growth of the world and distribution of the world. I would like to ask your questions, how they feel.
Okay, why don't you collect a couple more? Any other questions, comments? Yes, okay. Mr. Howe, Chairman Howe first, and then, okay, Dr. Kim, Dr. Lee first.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Baptist. When you refer to China risk, you mostly refer to economic risk of China, including credit, excessive credit. But my question is about Chinese political risk. More specifically, how smooth it will be the President Xi's attempt to take even the third term rule of the China. How smooth it will be is my question.
Okay, Chairman Howe, please.
Thank you for a great presentation. I have two bit detailed questions. One is your presentation shows the renminbi exchange rate is going to be 7.37, while current rate is about 6.5, and current trend of US dollar is weakening. So I have some mixed expectation about the renminbi versus the US dollar. So what is your view? Do you still maintain that the 7.37 going forward is the right expectation? The other one is, if you compare Brazil and Indonesia, two countries very similar, except the location, where they are located, right? And both countries has a huge commodity and also quite large population. But on your presentation, then the relative position of size of economy going forward, then Indonesia is going to improve, but Brazil is going to deteriorate. What makes that difference?
Okay, the last, yes, the then please, yes, okay.
Thank you. There's one wild card, and that is the unpredictability of President Trump. Suppose he really tries to cut down on imports from China. Suppose he really tries to jettison the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement. Suppose he takes other measures that could have a certain impact. I wonder if you could factor those in, or at least at least discuss them a little. Thank you.
Okay,
Okay.
yes.
Okay, thanks very much. So to begin with the question of inequality, I think it's a very important topic. And in fact, I think you're right, I probably should have more explicitly discussed it. Over the last few decades, it's correct, as you said, that global inequality has come down. What's happened is that's been about inequality between countries, and largely this has been about China. That China has gone from being a billion people in a very poor country to a billion people in a middle-income country. So that is what has caused the global income distribution to appear more equal. If we look within countries, it's become on average more unequal within a country. So more equal between, but less equal within. Why is that happening? I mean, it's still the subject of debate. So, Thomas Piketty wrote his famous book a couple of years ago on inequality. Have been others since. I do believe that there are some trends towards greater inequality that could cause growth to slow down. And one of these is the nature of today's technologies. So, a feature of digital technology is they operate at very large scales because they have very low marginal costs, right? If an extra person uses Facebook, it doesn't change Facebook's production costs, and there are real network benefits from digital technologies. I want to be on the same social network that everyone else is on, or if I'm going to buy something online, I might as well just go to the biggest shop, right? So I've got the most choice. So you tend to have a smaller number of companies dominating in the digital sector. So that is going to increase inequality actually, because then the shareholders or the employees of those companies that do get those strong market positions are going to capture all of that value. So I do think that's a risk for future growth. There was a question about the RMB. Next year, I do think it likely that the RMB goes through 7 to the US dollar. I mean, this is related to our thought that the Chinese economy will slow quite a lot, and if there's slowdown in investment and a tightening of monetary policy, I think the People's Bank of China and the Communist Party will be looking for other ways to kind of offset that growth somewhat. So I think they will have a depreciation of the RMB. They'll probably also have to keep the pressure off capital flight. So there are some other reasons why that needs to happen. So for the moment, yeah, we are sticking with that forecast that you saw. I think the yen and the euro are going to remain strong against the US dollar. But actually some other currencies are probably looking weaker than the RMB. So for example, I think the British pound and the Indian rupee are all going to be weaker than the US dollar over the next couple of years. For your interest, our forecast for the won is that it stays roughly similar to where it is now for the next 5 years. I think we have it's going up a small amount in 2019 or 2020. But compared to, say, Japan, which I know is an important comparison, where we have the yen going up by a lot more, so the won coming down against the yen. There was also a question about Brazil versus Indonesia and the relative growth outlooks. I mean, Indonesia's population is bigger and is probably going to grow faster, so that's one element. I think there's another element, which is Indonesia is much more tightly plugged into the fast growth regions of the world, so it's going to be much easier for Indonesia to tap into to become part of global supply chains, being located in East Asia, in the same way that Vietnam is now really benefiting from rising wages in southern China, and so it's going to be easier for Indonesia to connect up with infrastructure into where the growth is. So I think that's probably the main reason there. What was your question? Yeah, just give me yeah.
Politics in China.
Politics in China. Politics in China. Sorry, I couldn't remember all of them. I'm not worried about the political transition. Well, from an economic perspective, right? I mean, I have my own personal views about, what things I'd like to see happen in China. But in terms of the economy, I don't think that political transition will cause any instability. Xi seems to be in a very strong position. Over the last 18 months, he's replaced almost all of the party chiefs at the province level. And they're now all his people. Even old provincial or previous provincial leaders who were neutral about Xi have been sacked and replaced with Xi loyalists. So he's in a very strong position coming up into this party congress. Now, who really knows what's going on? So it's a very hidden kind of system. So we can make some guesses based upon what we see, and from everything that we can see and understand from an outsider's perspective. It looks like he's in a very strong position and is going to come out as the dominant figure after. And we even do think now the extent that he'll stay on for a third term. There's little appetite right now in China for social unrest. It's not around freedom of speech, it's not around labour market. As I said before, I think, the environment is where you see more protests in China, but the government is still hugely capable of shutting that down. If we remember the big explosion that happened in Tianjin, was that 18 months ago now, where a chemical warehouse exploded, who knows what went into the atmosphere, and it was a real demonstration of the really poor safety and environmental standards and the risk that actually posed to people's lives. A whole bunch of apartments with people in them were blown up. Even that barely dented the surface of public debate in China. I was there a few weeks after it happened, and it was just nowhere to be discussed. And the government, even as vibrant as social media is in China, the government shut down public kind of debate around that. People talked about it privately, but they didn't know a lot about it. So discussion was a little bit ill-informed. But it shows that even such a big event, I was shocked in a way that China got away with that, without that making more of an impact. And I think it shows just the level of control they do have. Now, going further out, I do think we are likely to see political change in China before 2050. When will it happen? Probably not in the next 5 years, maybe sometime in the 2020s. There are increasing rigidities in Chinese society. There are some big issues around aging, I think, and provision of public services that are going to come to the fore. I think environmental issues are. Government is doing more on that front, but probably not fast enough. And there's also the issue about innovation, and can you really continue to develop and move to high income status without kind of freedom of expression and freedom of, for example, freedom of academic opinion. I think probably not. And so China will hit some of those barriers in the future. But right now, its GDP per person is still a long way behind that of the US. So it's still got a lot of catch-up growth to do before those issues really become critical. And then, or rather critical to the point where social unrest might happen. So long term, I think yes, social unrest. Short term, no. As for Trump, well, I guess he's incorporated into our forecasts because he's a reality, so he's not a prediction. So he's already here now. What he will do is some kind of prediction. I mean, I think he is probably mostly a short-term phenomenon. Our expectation is he won't have a second term. Still pretty early to make that call, so I wouldn't stick by that too strongly. But current signs are that the Democrats look likely to do well in the next midterm elections. He's not cooperating with his own party very effectively, so that probably is not a positive factor for him getting the next Republican nomination. And we don't even know whether he wants it. But if he did, would he get it? Question mark. Then would he win? Would then of course depend on what happened on the Democratic side and who their nominee was. But the early signs are not excellent for him being a two-term president. But legacies can very quickly be undone. We've seen him undo a lot of what Obama did quite quickly as well. And I mean, this is in a way strength of the US system. Institutions are very strong, and a president can have some impact, but there's a lot that a president doesn't have an impact on, or that's very slow to change. The biggest impact, I think, is international affairs, where he's accelerated the trend that was already happening of the US like being less engaged internationally and being less of the global policeman. He's withdrawn from that. The new thing he's added, which is very anti what Obama was doing, was he has really removed respect for the rules-based system. So Trump himself does not respect the rule-based international order. And the US was the enforcer of that order, and there's a bunch of other countries like China, like Russia, who have always hated the rules-based order. They prefer an interest-based order. So China likes to make decisions not based upon principles, but based upon what suits China at the time, same way that Russia makes decisions. Trump's now doing that as well. So now effectively there's no big powers pushing the rules-based order. So we're seeing it break down, and therefore things like the Qatar crisis come up. It's probably going to be hard to put back in the box, I think. Once that system degrades, very difficult to build back up. I mean, right now, who's defending that system? Sweden, Switzerland, New Zealand, Canada, so not very powerful countries. So I think that's probably the longer term impact. Probably that trend happening anyway, because of the rise of China and other powers in Asia that are less inclined by a principles-based approach to international affairs, but yeah, accelerating under Trump.
Okay, I suppose we can go on all day. There's so many issues and challenges, and I suppose all this, even after Trump, given, as you pointed out, the very rapid changes in technology, not necessarily just globalization, but globalization plus this technological change will cause this distributional issue, and that will become socio-political challenges. So there are a lot of issues and geopolitical issues as well. As economist Charles Kindleberger pointed out a long time ago, it's called the Kindleberger trap, and that is that the world may not have enough public goods because leading countries, China is now ready to provide public goods, and the U.S. is no longer affordable to provide public. But in any case, overall, your EIU's projection, one thing I didn't like very much is Korea is missing from the top list, but we have to make an effort. And I think really seriously, if unification can come, it can be change the situation. But
We have not worked it into our forecast yet.
right, yeah. So I think that you said it'll be short-term cost, but the long-term benefit. But anyway, we have to close here.